Thank you. Okay. Dr. Willy Kotiuga is a professional engineer with over 40 years of experience in international advisory services. He recently retired from SNC-Lavalin, one of the world's largest engineering firms, where he was Senior Director, Strategic Studies in the Clean Energy Division. He's authored numerous technical papers on electrical energy infrastructure, planning, and frequently speaks at conferences. He spent most of his career advising electric utilities and governments on the sustainable development of power network infrastructure and long-term strategic planning. During his career, he worked in over 25 countries and spent significant time in China, India, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Saudi Arabia, and Senegal. As an infrastructure project director, he has orchestrated complex projects involving multiple stakeholders, including governments and international funding institutions such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and African Development Bank. Willy also serves on the executive committees of several nonprofit organizations, such as World Vision, Welcome Hall, BGU, Christian Direction, and Cedar Lodge. Thank you, Willy, for being here today to give us this talk, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And the last time I spoke to a Rotary Club was about 20 years ago in a town called Tiruvananthapuram in India. And if you can pronounce that, you can also go there, but everything is closed, and it's been closed since COVID hit. And Glenn Shepard asked me, well, what would you call this talk? And I said, why don't we call it Smoothing the Edges? And it's about the role of boards in civil society. And basically, although I'm an engineer, my role has been, to a large extent over the last 30 years, been restructuring companies. I got my start in terms of boards really quite early on when I was president of the Concordia University Graduate Students Association. And then for 2 years, I sat on the Concordia University board, which was quite interesting because you had all the Jesuits from Loyola and you had the board members. So we were about 35, which is fairly large. But it was interesting. It introduced me to what governance is all about. More recently, I am on the board of World Vision, on the Corporation of World Vision Canada, which raises about $400 and some million every year for children around the world, for the welfare of children. For the last 5 years, I've been on the board of Welcome Hall Mission. You may have heard of them, and they've been very much involved in terms of getting people homeless into homes. And it's very different. Their operation is about $20 million a year that they run. I also sit on the Board of Regents and chair the Board of Regents for Baki Graduate University. That's that BGU that Susan mentioned. And they're involved in online learning, but they grant PhDs and master's degrees, and their reach is worldwide. Locally, Christian Direction is an advocacy group and working to build relations in the community. And then Cedar Lodge Association, it's really, we own a property, and I am president of that. But what we give it out is we rent out the facilities to poor organizations or organizations that can't afford, so they can take advantage of the 28 acres right on Lake Memphremagog. And so with all this experience, one of the things that I have looked at is what is the contribution of these boards? I mean, why am I sitting on these boards? Why do I give a lot of time to these? And the role of boards adds a lot to civil society. For example, one of the things is governance. Governance is all about making sure that it runs right. You know, we've had issues in Canada which are high profile, such as with the We Charities, and people taking over those things. When we deal with boards, there's two type of boards that and we have to look at them differently. One is a policy board, and I sit on a number of policy boards where the role of the board is to set the policy, the direction. There's operational boards where everybody gets their hands dirty and everybody is involved in the nitty-gritty of it. And they run fairly differently. On a policy board, there's an expectation that you have a lot of experience, that you add something to it. And usually policy boards will include lawyers, will include finance people, HR people, and then members at large. Whereas operational boards is, hey, you've got time to give, you want to give, just come along, we can use the extra hands. So what is the role of boards? One of the things is to maintain continuity. The one thing I do remember is the four-way, or as you said, the five-way with the fifth-way test. And that I remember from when I spoke in Tiruvananthapuram. But it gets us to focus on the values and the mission. And so often the role of the board is overlooked. Who is going to control what? That's not what it's about. It's all about maintaining continuity, making sure that the founders' values continue to be presented. But then there's another role, and that is what I call functionality. Functionality has been ignored in the past. And what do I mean by functionality? There are three things that make sure that a board is functioning well, and the organization also. One is to be resilient, two, sustainable, and three, scalable. What do I mean by resilient? Well, what happens when COVID hits? I mean, you've gone to Zoom, you've continued your work, you've continued your endeavors. So when we get sideswiped, when something comes that upsets the way that we normally do things, how resilient are we? Can we go into another mode of operation? And that's the role of the board. The other thing is to make sure it's sustainable. Because if you keep on getting into debt, it's not sustainable. But also scalable. Scalable means how can the board adjust when there are lots of revenue coming in, a lot of donations coming in, or very few. So that's another role. But the ultimate role is accountability. Who are we accountable to? Are we accountable to the founders? Are we accountable to our own little group? Are we accountable to a larger organization? And accountability so often is thought of, oh, well, we'll do an audit. Well, you do need metrics. And those metrics are there not to check off whether you've done everything right or have done anything wrong, but it's there to improve. One of my joys is also teaching courses, and I teach a PhD course on the metrics of innovation. And this is for leaders who have great ideas, but how do they make sure that they attain those goals? One of the reasons I joined World Vision Board is when I was invited, I don't like to see money wasted. I don't think any one of us does. But when they go into communities to help children develop, to have an education, the only way that they get approval to spend money going into them is if they have an exit plan. And basically, once you've attained your goal, you get out and you move on to something else. Well, some of that could be 20 years exit plan, some of it by targets, but basically, if you can get out, then you can keep on renewing things and not get stuck in quagmires. And so the role of metrics is to determine, when do you leave? When do you adjust? Who do you get on? What are some of the projects you want to do? Essentially, it's a key element in terms of making the world a better place. But the other role of boards is sometimes we forget about it, is that it's encouragement. It's about inspiring people. It's about to enable future endeavors. Can you imagine what Canada and the US would look like if they hadn't built the railroads out west? There would be no development there. And so what are things that boards can do that ensure that the motivation for starting an organization keeps on going? And so it's there to enable future endeavors, to make sure that things move forward in a positive way. And then there are contributions to society. You know, I find it really interesting when I listen to the newscasts. They start off, good evening, and then they spend the next hour giving you bad news. Oh, maybe there's a 5-minute little break of a good news story. But boards are there to encourage. They're an expression of gratitude. But also, when we look at reports and what things happen, they're also an example of the power of generosity. And so often we forget about those things, especially if it's a policy board and you have people who are directors, but then you have a professional staff. And that's where boards can play a big role in terms of encouraging staff, sharing ideas. Part of a great value that Rotary brings is about being part of a larger organization, a worldwide organization. And I first learned of Rotary when I kept on having experts come into my projects, whether I was in India or in Saudi Arabia or in different places. And the first thing that they asked is, where does the Rotary Club meet? And so I've always, on my checklist before they came out, I said, they meet Thursday nights at this hotel, or they meet Tuesday nights at this hotel. And so I attended a number of meetings, and there's this camaraderie. And these things are important. And one of the roles of boards, and my role, and I've been on board since 1975, is all about what can we do to encourage people, to promote things about giving, about generosity. And so governance, maintaining continuity, being functional, having some type of accountability, encouraging, those things all contribute to society. And you keep on trying things. And, you know, just as the one thing didn't work out that you were trying to do, well, so what? You try something else. I know on the Christian Direction Board, one of the things that I always encouraged, and it's now become a line item in every board meeting, is innovation, ideas, and spend some time just talking about ideas. And some of those things have made a big difference in terms of how you're able to reach those people who are marginalized, and also draw in people who would like to be part of it. And that's what makes this world a better place, is that when people who God has blessed can work with those who are on the front lines, making a difference. One of the reasons I'm involved with Welcome Home Mission is because they're on the front lines. You know, and they built a reputation, and organizations built a reputation. And one of the things I liked, what I saw in this pandemic, is the government needed something to be done with the homeless. And all of a sudden, okay, Welcome Home Mission, you've got a good track record. Well, the board holds them accountable. But with that track record, the government says, look, here's $500,000, do something for the homeless. And it's about pulling people together so that it is people who have a passion who keep on giving. So the role of boards is to make sure that they are enablers, that they help organizations to give out the best that they possibly can. And so that's basically how I see the role of boards. And the way that they smooth out the edges is if everybody was working and not bringing in their expertise, it would be rough in doing that. And I'm surprised and I'm really thrilled with what happened with organizations such as the Old Brewery Mission, Maison Boineau, and all those who are working with the homeless, is how they rallied together and worked together because their boards enabled them and encouraged their staff to do that. So boards have a great role, and if you're on any boards, thank you for your contribution to making our civil society a better place. So I'm open to questions. I don't know how you do things, but I could talk too long. I can talk in chapters rather than in paragraphs about all the things that I do. But thank you for inviting me and giving me a chance to just share some of the things. I hope it's been a word of encouragement.
Very encouraging, Willy. Thank you very much. Very uplifting. We are open to questions. And does anyone have a question for Willy? Oh, this is very, very unusual, Willy. I'm sure somebody's thinking something up.
I do.
Where is it? Jim?
Jim.
Yeah, go ahead.
Willy, I believe, were you ever on the board of directors of SNC?
No, I was a senior director, but not with the board. And but I knew all the old people, the people that got kicked out on the board. I knew them all personally. So what's your question? It's a good time to ask me because I'm writing my memoir and I just finished the whole part about this corruption and anti-corruption and holding people accountable. So go ahead, ask any question.
Well, I know somebody very, very well who was been on the board of directors of SNC ever since the debacle started. And he hasn't told me any tales out of school, but he's certainly told me that it was I guess the best way to put it was a very, very interesting time to be working on that board and how difficult it was and some of the decisions that they had to make along the way. So I was just going to ask you, in an instance like that, the board of directors, how much power do they have, and because this was a real ethics issue that they were dealing with, how do they deal with that kind of thing?
Well, I think one of the roles of the board is to be very proactive and to see this thing coming. And today, you know, if you look at board meetings, what happens is, are we meeting our targets? Are our shareholders getting value for the investments that we make? And it's become very short term. In Europe, they're going to reporting every 1 or 2 years. They're going away from quarterly reporting because it's all focused on bringing up shareholder value. But what happens, you make short-term decisions. And when I look at SNC, and I actually started with Shawinigan Engineering, which was then bought out by Lavalin, which was then merged with SNC. And there were very different corporate cultures. When I started, it was like a family. In fact, Shawinigan Engineering, it was shareholders and they were employees. It was employee owned. When it came to Lavalin, it was a family. But when it became driven by bonuses and stocks and share value, they looked at the numbers, they ticked off the boxes saying we're doing this. But they didn't invest in time in terms of accountability and accountability at each one of the divisional structures. And with all the mergers, people were there to make, a lot of the directors were there to make a big buck, and it just changed the whole culture of the organization. But my view is we have to use metrics and have the appropriate metrics in place so that it can trigger, hey, we've got to watch this. Not with the idea of putting people in jail, but in terms of making the organizational law better, more sustainable. And this is why I talk about in my talks about resilience, about being scalable. And one of the things that they didn't look at was we were scaling up too much. We're making profit. And so what happened, some of the family values got lost.
Thank you.
We have a question from Glenn. Willie, is it becoming harder to recruit board members and why? Can I assume, Glenn, that you mean nonprofits, for nonprofits? Yeah. Okay, go ahead, please.
Well, Glenn knows some of the problems because we're trying to recruit. And one of the things is when a lot of these nonprofits started as operational. People were involved in day-to-day activities. But when they start getting larger, like Welcome Hall Mission, it had a budget of less than $1 million about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And now its budget is $20 million. You know, people have been very generous. But then you need a different type of board because now you're accountable. And especially with COVID and running these hotels for the homeless during the key crisis, a lot of government money coming in. It's less of a family, but you need some expertise in there. And people also recognize there's a responsibility that you're accountable. So most boards, they have board insurance to make sure that if there is any case against them, that the board members are protected. So that's one way to help in the recruitment process. But people are busy, much more busier than they have ever been, and they have less time. And so they're not willing to give things up. One of the things that we've done at Welcome Hall Mission is we wanted to have more, a younger board, and we wanted to have a balance with women. Well, what happens to try to recruit when you have evening meetings, you know, once a month or whenever you have them, and they're young families. These women, you know, they're working full time, they're trying to do things. So we've gone to lunchtime meetings. So we start at 11 and we finish at 1 o'clock. They can take time off easily from work and they have freedom. And we found that the quality of our discussions is better. Whereas before, you know, the 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock evening meeting dragged till 10 o'clock. You know, it created problems. So we're trying to do things that encourage people to recruit, but it is still hard because we want to make sure that the people on the board represent the constituencies that we serve.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question from Martin. He's our reporter in our audience today. Stephen Jaroslawski has long been an advocate for corporate governance reform. Is there a parallel to what you're doing?
Well, at my last count, I think I sit on 8 boards, a number of them international. And I've chosen not to sit on corporate boards. It's all nonprofit. And I think our metrics are wrong. Let me give you an example of where metrics go wrong. I'm also the independent engineer of a number of organizations, primarily representing lenders or investors. And one electric utility in Cameroon was always losing money. And so they privatized it, they gave it out as a concession, but still the money was not coming in. And they looked at something what they call the basically one of the metrics was how much money do you collect that you build out. So let's say they build out $10 million. They were getting less than $5 million, so their operation was not becoming sustainable. They hired a new president, and they said, okay, one of your metrics is going to be that your rate of collection rate goes up. It's 45%. We want you to hit 75%, and then you'll get a bonus. Well, he hit it in the first year. But you know what he did? He never sent out bills to the non-payers. He only sent out invoices to the people who regularly paid. He got his bonus and he quit and left the company. So you have to do your metrics right. And it requires a lot of understanding of what the culture of the organization is. And too often people apply just general templates. Oh, this is what they do. What are these ratios? But you have to get into the culture of the organization and develop different types of metrics.
Thank you. Any other questions for Willy? I have a question, Willy. I would imagine that with the boards that you're on that are overseas, that you're used to doing, virtual meetings. We're all forced to have virtual meetings, even though we're in the same town. Do you see organizations moving towards that even after the COVID restrictions are lifted? Or do you like the physical presence, of a board meeting?
Well, I think the physical presence is essential. Like if you go to a conference, if you've been to every conference, you listen to speakers, they speak things. But what's the real value? The real value comes through the networking, through the things that are talked about in the corridor, the chit chat. Now, I'd love it if Zoom could come up with a feature that basically says, yeah, I'd like to talk to you. And you could go into a side room and just have a little chit chat. And that's really important. I think the reason that it's working now is because a lot of the boards, they have a history. They've been working together. They know each other. They know the stories about the families. I mean, in Zoom, you don't talk about your families. Or you talk a little bit, but not to the in-depth and not in the way you used to before. So I believe a hybrid solution would work. But I'd like to see technology evolve that you can just say, okay, Susan, hey, I heard about this, and just go off to the side and, in a whisper, stage whisper. And so it's working now, but remember, there's a lot of legacy where in the past, people knew each other and they trust. And the Zoom calls, and I've been on Zoom for years, they work best when you actually know the people, when you've had one-on-ones.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. I wonder if you can comment on the importance of having more women sitting on the boards of directors. Thank you.
Well, I must say it's in every organization I've always looked at what is the composition, who is our constituency. And I feel very good that at any time that I was on the nomination committee of boards, very soon it was either more women than men, but they all played a significant role. One of the boards I was on, I noticed it was an old boys club. It was started in 1963, and when I was asked to join the board, I was the youngest by at least half the average. I was 28 years old, and the average age of the board was 67. And so one of the things, after 3 years, I was invited to be chair of the board. And within about 6 years, we've got to parity. But it was also another reason is because it's also the chair of the board that helps set direction and wanted to recruit many so that they would have learned the ropes and also fit in and make good chairs of the board. And so you need that. One of the things that is really important is to have different perspectives. We see things differently. We do things differently. We need the advice of the whole community. And it's really one of the roles of the board is to have wisdom, to accumulate it from different perspectives. And if I look at boards today, and if it's all men and if it's all young, I'm not ready to give. You know, I want to trust my donations with an organization that is inclusive. And so it's a struggle, but in terms of, I think I was a very successful chair of many boards because of the number of women that were on the board. And it's, so that's my perspective.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else that has a question for Willy? Okay, well, Willy, thank you so very much for that talk. It was enlightening. There's a term that I hear often, and that is servant leader. And your talk really rings, you know, true in that respect. And the skill and the dedication that is required, and also the metrics that are important. A lot of us here are on various boards, so it's also very personally relevant to all of us. So thank you very much for coming today and for giving us that talk. And Heather, did you want to stop the recording?